So in this video, we're going to be learning about how we can configure our runnables. But what does that mean? What does it mean to configure a runnable? Now, the definition here says runnable configuration is a way to give your runnables or chains a set of instructions and information that you can pass along with your input, influencing how the runnable behaves without changing its logic. So it's two major things. You configure your runnables to do two major things. First, to influence how your runnable behaves, influence how they behave. Number two, which is a lot of the configuration by the time we eventually see the options that we have, is passing information. So there are some standard information that you can pass. For example, remember I told you that you can set a name for your runnable. That's part of the information you can pass. There was a time we also saw tags. We tried to output tags, even though we got no tags. So you can tag your runnables, you can or your chains, which are also runnables. You can add metadata and stuff. So you can add information and you can influence the run of the way the runnable runs without affecting its core logic, without affecting the whole workflow, definition of the workflow. So that's basically what runnable configuration is all about. And runnable configuration is defined using the RunnableConfig class. Yeah, RunnableConfig. That's what you use to define your runnable configuration. The RunnableConfig class is from the LangChain core runnables package. So that's where we find it. It basically produces a dictionary-like object that provides context and parameters for a specific execution of a runnable or a chain. So at the end of the day, you get a dictionary of configuration. That's from RunnableConfig, where you pass all the arguments that RunnableConfig can take. It will simply give you back a dictionary of setup instructions for your runnable, and you can pass it in your runnable in different ways that we're going to be seeing later. So that is how runnable configuration works. Now let us look at the parameters that are available to us to configure. What are the things that we can configure? So first is run name. You can configure the run name. That's the name we want to give to the run. And this can be very, very important, especially with tracing tools. When you need to trace activities, when you need to trace stuff in monitoring tools, you would need to set a name for your runs. It will help you to differentiate one run from the other one and be able to, for example, if there's one that is causing error, you'll be able to know that, okay, this particular run, this particular runnable, this particular chain is what is causing an error. So yeah, run name. Second, we have tags. You can add tags. Tags are organizational elements that you can attach to your runs. Maybe some runs are related to a particular type of workflow, maybe transactions. So you just tag them transactions. If some are about the user profile, you can tag them profile. So at the end of the day, when you are investigating them, you can be able to categorize, okay, these sets are for the transactions, these sets are for the user profile activity that is going on the application. And it can also be very useful when you are filtering in your monitoring tools. LangSmith as a native monitoring tool to LangChain, tags are very, very important. In fact, some things are just auto-tagged. So tags, you can pass in tags. Also, you can have metadata. Sometimes you just want to pass in some information to your run. Probably you want to collect at the other end. You just want to pass in some information, things like session IDs, user IDs, any kind of information from your application. You can pass it as metadata. And that can be useful at any point in your workflow, whether for logging, for tracing stuff. For example, you can add a custom trace ID as a metadata. Sometimes you are using a tracing tool from a third party, and they have a trace ID that needs to be carried on from runnable to runnable or from chain to chain. These are the kind of things that you can put into your metadata. We also have max concurrency. We have max concurrency. And as you can see, it is an integer. I've cleaned this off, so let me correct that. Get the eraser, get this off, take my pen. Okay, so we have max concurrency. Now, this is an integer that limits the number of parallel operations that can occur within a runnable. We say runnable parallel. We can have runnables running in parallel, but sometimes you don't want more than 5. You don't want more than 5. So you can set this limit so that only 5 runnables can run at once. Others will just go into a pool, and when it's when some of the runnables that are running in the current limit, that's the 5 limit, when they're done, then that one can another one can come in. but it will not run more than 5 runnables at once. It will not, in a runnable parallel, it will not run more than 5 runnables at once. Whether they are just plain runnables or they are chains, it will only run 5 at once if you set it as 5. If you set max concurrency as 5. Another one is recursion limit, which is also an integer value, and it sets the maximum depth for recursive calls within a chain or an agent. And this really helps you prevent infinite loops. Because when you're crafting your runnables, you can have sub-runnables and sub-runnables and sub-runnables. You want to control how much recursion is going on so that you don't end up with an infinite loop. So a recursion limit of like 3, 4, probably good enough. You don't want to be nesting too deep. So yeah, recursion limit is also something that you can set so that your runnables would behave and not just spin out of control. Let's go to the next set of parameters that we can configure. So we also have configurable. Now, configurable is a dictionary for dynamically selecting specific implementations or parameters for a configurable runnable at runtime. Now, let me just save you all that English. What configurable basically does is that for the elements in your chain, let's say a chat model or a prompt template, sometimes you want to configure them at runtime. So you set up the chain is already set up, the model is initialized. Let's say the model is initialized, a certain temperature, let's say temperature of 0.1 or 0.3. But for a particular run of that chain, you want to change the temperature. So this is not you changing the old chain. This is you changing a runnable within the chain. So here you can pass parameters for that particular runnable. You can say, okay, I set temperature to this value, and it's going to change that temperature on the fly for that particular run. It's going to change that temperature on the fly for that particular run. Now, the setup is a bit more complicated than that, but we're going to be seeing that in the next video. You'll see how to configure a chat model within a chain at runtime. And the chat model is just one of the things that you can configure at runtime like that. So that's what configurable does. In configurable, you can pass in the runtime values for certain parameters for a specific runnable within your chain. We also have return intermediate steps, which a boolean, if set to true, it's false by default. If set to true, it can return the intermediate results within a chain. You know, so far, we've just been getting the final result in the chain, the output at the very last runnable. But if you set intermediate steps to true, you can actually get the result for each step in the chain. For each runnable in the chain, you get the result. And we also have callbacks. Now, callbacks do something similar to with listeners. They have certain events that you can add event handlers to on end, on start and stuff like that. Then I think there's on LLM start, on LLM. Yeah, there are a bunch of events that you can use callbacks to actually feed a callback into. So yeah, and it's also useful for the same things that we've looked at with listeners. That is for logging, for monitoring, and for debugging. So those are the parameters that you can configure. Now let's look at what a runnable config looks like. How does a runnable configuration looks like? So when you want to create a runnable configuration, you simply call the runnable config class. Config class, and then you can set the parameters as keyword arguments. As you can see in this example, right with my pen. Okay, in this example, let me pick the red pen. You see here we are setting the run name. We're setting some tags here: single run, demo invoke, some metadata, which is a dictionary, max concurrency 3, so we can only run 3 parallel items at the same time, and callbacks. You see on run start, on run end. So you can pass in handlers for that. So this is how you create a runnable configuration. You call runnable config, and you can set any of the parameters we're looking at as keyword arguments and set them to their respective values, whether strings, lists, like tags is a list, metadata is a dictionary, max concurrency is an integer, as we've been mentioning when we are defining the parameters that can be configured. So now, how can the configuration be implemented? We just saw how we can create the configuration, but how can it be implemented? Now, you can implement it in 2 ways. The first is per-invocation. That means configuring on the fly. This happens when you want to invoke the chain or invoke the runnable. So when you want to invoke the chain or when you want to invoke the runnable, you pass in a config parameter. That's after the input, probably a dictionary or whatever input that the runnable is expecting. So after the input, you can pass in the config parameter, then set the config parameter to the RunnableConfig configuration that you created. So that is going to take place on the fly. It's not going to occur for every run of that particular chain. It's just for that particular run that you set config for when calling invoke or a invoke. You can also make it persistent. You can attach the configuration to a particular chain so that anytime that chain is run, whether config is passed in or not, it's going to actually use those configuration sets. So that's the persistent configuration style. And what you basically do is that on your runnable or on your chain, you call the withConfig method. And you pass in your runnable configuration that you created with RunnableConfig. You call the withConfig method and pass in your runnable configuration. But like I said, this will be persistent for every invocation of that runnable. Whether you're batching, whether you're streaming or invoking, synchronously or asynchronously, is going to be persistent for that particular runnable or chain. Now, you can modify some of those configurations, those default configurations for a particular run. So you can still use config to just modify any one of them that you need to modify. And for that specific run, it is going to be modified. So yeah, that's how to configure runnables. Now let's go into VS Code and start writing out some runnable configurations. So in this demo, we're going to be doing our typical prompt, model, and output parser chain. We're going to be doing that. Then we're going to be creating a configuration. We're going to be creating a configuration that will include some tags, some metadata and stuff. And we're going to be running it. We're going to do the run invocation and the persistent invocation. We're going to do per-invocation and we're going to do the persistent configuration. Yeah, we're going to do those two. Now, we're also going to be adding event handlers. We're going to be adding event handlers so that we can actually see our tags and we can see our metadata to know that they actually exist within that run. So anytime that we run our runnable, we're going to have those listeners print out our values, the values that we configured. So let us begin. Quickly, let us get in our usual suspects, LangChain core, our chat prompt template. Then from LangChain core, from LangChain OpenAI rather, let's import our chat OpenAI. Let's also get our parser from LangChain core. Good. Now we're also going to be getting two things. First, we're going to get our RunnableConfig. So I'm going to say from LangChain core .runnables import RunnableConfig. Then for our event handlers, I'm just going to get our run object, tracers.schemas, import run. Cool. So we get this. Now let us set up our chain. First, we set up our model. Say chat OpenAI. Set our model to GPT-4o mini that we've been using so far. Our prompt, just going to set that to chat prompt template. Dot from templates, not from, but from template. And then we're going to say, tell me a fact about topic. Yeah, tell me a fact about topic. Then our parser is going to be an instance of the string output parser. So that's cool. Now we can create a base chain. Just call it base chain. And it will be prompt model parser. Cool. Prompt model parser. So now we have a base chain to work with. So the next thing we're going to do in order to see some of the configuration parameters that we're going to be attaching to this chain, we're going to add a listener. We're going to add a listener for our on start so that we can see some of those configuration parameters. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to steal a listener from here. I'm going to steal the start listener from here. Just get it here. Then I'm going to bring it here. So once we have this listener, I'm then going to create a chain with listeners. Then I'm going to take the base chain, call with listeners, and I'm going to set the onStart listener to my listener function. So that will undo the onStart event. So that's good. Now this is the chain that we are going to be configuring. Like I said, we just want to add the listeners so that we can see some of those things that we are imputing. Because if we just run the chain, we're not going to see anything. We're not going to see anything. Except we have LangSmith in place. If we have LangSmith in place, we can easily just jump into LangSmith and we'll see some of those stuff. But yeah, I'm not going to assume that you know LangSmith that well for us to add that to this. But at least you know how with listeners work. So we're going to take this chain with listeners. And the first demo we're going to be doing 2 demos. One with the per-invocation configuration and one for the persistent configuration. So we're going to do those 2 demos. But before that, let us create our configuration itself. So I'm going to say my runnable configuration. Let's set that to RunnableConfig. So what are the kind of things that we want to configure here? First, I would like to configure the run name. Yeah, configure the run name and say configuration demo. Call it configuration demo. So configure the run name. Also, let us add some tags. I'm just going to say simple or single run tag. And this is for a demo invocation. So let's say demo invoke. So a single run tag for a demo invoke. Pretty cool. Now let's say I have some metadata I just want to pass along. Just some arbitrary data that I just want to hang around within here. So that I can, for example, if I'm checking my monitoring tool, I can know, let's say, which user ID or which session ID this came from. So I can say things like user ID. And just type some gibberish in there. Then I can say source. Let's call it manual test. So this is coming from a manual test. I can also add something like input topic type. Something to mark it according to the data we're passing in. I can say history because I'll probably be asking it historical questions. So history. So we just set all those metadata. It can be anything. This is where you can dump any stuff. Here and in tags. Tags are for organization. Metadata is for passing your own custom data in through the runnable. So we have our runnable configuration. So now we can run our first demo. And that is going to be our demo 1, which is per-invocation configuration. So that's demo 1. Per-invocation configuration. So let's run that. Now remember I told you when you want to configure per-invocation, when you call invoke, per-invocation, when you call invoke, you will now set a config keyword argument after your input. Set a config keyword argument and then you pass in the configuration. So for that particular invocation, that configuration is going to apply. So let's say per invoke result. Then we can take our chain with listeners. And we can call invoke. We call invoke. First, we need to pass it what it expects, which is the data. And that's topic, is expecting a topic because in our prompt template here, we're looking for a topic. So say topic. For this topic, I'm just going to say the Roman Empire. Then to make the configuration apply for this particular run, for this particular invocation, we set the config argument and set it to our configuration, which is my runnable configuration. So we set it to our configuration. Is that here? That's good. And now to see the result, we can just simply say print. And we say result from per-invocation. or I'm just going to say result because I've already marked this as per invocation up here. So result, and we're just going to paste in the results. Just going to paste in the result. So that is our per invocation demo, but we still need to see it in action. We need to see it in action. So let us save this. Pull up our command line. Pull up our command line. Now I'm going to run Python configuring runnables. Python configuring runnables, because that's the name of our file. Does it enter and open no errors? So immediately we get our listener for the start. Is outputting the stuff that we wanted to print. So if we look at our listener, we go back to our listener. First, we said listener start for run.name. So we're printing out the name of the run. Then we're printing out the ID of the run. Then after that, we're printing out the inputs. Then we print out the run, the parent ID for the run, if any. Then finally, we're printing out the tags and the metadata. Tags and the metadata. So if we pull up our command line, here we can see listener start for configuration demo, which was the name that we gave it, configuration demo. So listener start for configuration demo. The inputs are topic, the Roman Empire. It has no parent ID. The tags are demo invoke and single run tag, which are the tags that we give it. And the metadata, we have the user ID, we have source, and we have input topic type, which is history. And from our result, we see the result about the Roman Empire. So yeah, that's how you configure per invocation. So that's all good. Now let us see how to configure persistently. We were going to attach the configuration to a chain. So anytime that chain is run, it will just run with the configured parameters. So let us come down here. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this configuration and create another one for the persistent guy. So copy this. Come down here. Let's say demo 2. Persistent configuration. So let's have that down here. I'm going to call this my persistent configuration. So my persistent configuration, for this, I'm going to call it persistent config demo. For the tag, I'll say persistent tag demo 2. And then for the metadata, input topic type, let us change it to animals. So can query something about an animal. It's still a manual test and the user ID is still the same. So, but you can always change this to whatever you want. So we have that persistent configuration, and now we can attach this persistent run to our chain. I'm going to test something out. So I'll say persistent run. Then first, what we're going to do, we're just going to take the chain. We're going to say chain with listeners. So sorry, this is not persistent run. Persistent chain. So I'm going to say chain with listeners dot with config. Remember I told you, if you want your configuration to be persistent, you have to use with config. So I'll say with config, then I'm going to pass in this configuration. So we'll just go in here, pass this in. And now when we run this chain, it should automatically just run with the configuration. So I'm going to create another print statement here. Well, let's just come up here and copy stuff. So we'll copy this. Come down here. Say demo 2. And demo 2 is for persistent configuration. Now, here I'm going to be, this is going to be persistent result. Instead of chain with listeners, we're going to be invoking persistent chain. And we don't need to pass this config. All we need to do is pass in the topic. And since I already mentioned that the input topic type is animals, I'm just going to put an animal here and say spiders. And we'll print our persistent result. Now, this should run using the persistent configuration. We didn't have to pass it in when we are invoking it. It will just run because we've already created a persistent chain that has a persistent configuration. So let's try that. Let's comment out this so that it doesn't clash with the other example. So let's pull our command line up, clear, and run the file. So we immediately get our listener printing out the stuff that we gave it to print. It's things we told it to print. The topic is spiders, which is the input. You see now our name is persistent config demo. The tags are demo to invoke and persistent tag, and we have our metadata, which has an input topic type of animals. So you see, we didn't have to pass anything to invoke. We just invoked the already persistent chain and it worked. Now, one other way, like I said, I want to test out something. One other way you can pass this in, to config is just take this keyword arguments and put them inside config as keyword arguments. So take the keyword arguments, instead of explicitly writing RunnableConfig, so you can do this and just send these parameters straight inside with config. Just send them straight inside with config. So let us run this once again to make sure that our assumption is correct. Let's go Python, configuring runnables. And yeah, everything still works as expected. We're still getting all the tags and the metadata that we put in. Our run name is persistent config demo, which we configured. And everything is beautiful as it should be. So that's how you configure your runnables. If you're going to use your max iteration, max concurrency, and other configurable that we're going to be seeing in the next video, that's how you configure. Whether you want to do it per invocation or you want to do it persistently, there are no right or wrong answers. It's just based on use cases. You know how to do it. Now you know how to do it. In the next video, we're going to be doing that runtime configuration of runnables within a chain. Like I said, here we are configuring the entire runnable. But let's see how we can say, yeah, the chat model for this particular run needs a higher temperature. And we just configure just that. And it will apply for that particular run. So see you in the next video.